listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. Thank you for joining us as you do each and every week. Before we get started with this week's episode, just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you to everybody who listens to the show. You guys have been sending us a lot of love. Keep the emails coming. We certainly appreciate all your feedback and all your thoughts as well. Make sure you get on iTunes, leave us a rating and review. We read all of them, and we want to hear the feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. We take all that stuff seriously because we want to put out the best show each week for you guys. And we know how much you certainly appreciate hearing these stories, and we want to continue to tell them and tailor it to the audience, to what you guys really want to hear each and every week. We think we do a great job of that, but we certainly appreciate all the feedback that you guys give us. Please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. That helps us as well. Again, the feedback that we get from those social media sites is awesome. It's also a way we communicate what episode is coming up this week and give you information about it. And this way you can also, know a little bit more about each guest before you start to listen. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter as well if you want. Mark Zino, MarkZinno for both of those. And I'll keep you updated on all the stories and everything else that I have each week with the Hazard Ground, so you can give me and the Hazard Ground a follow on both those things. Final reminder about our promotion with Amazon, our deal with those guys. Go to hazardground.com, click on the Amazon banner, and once you click on that Amazon banner, you can do all your regular shopping, and we get a portion of what you guys spend, and we donate it back to one of the great charities you've heard here on the Hazard Ground. And speaking of charities and veterans organizations, that brings us to this week's guest. Joining us this week is currently the executive director of the Headstrong Project. Previously, he was the director of leadership for Team RWB, that's red, white, and blue. He had multiple deployments to Iraq and a deployment to Afghanistan as an advisor to General David Petraeus. He is Joe Quinn joining us here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Joe, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mark.
All right, Headstrong Project, a huge undertaking. In fact, you are in Atlanta as we record this because you guys are opening up a chapter here, which is fantastic because that's where I'm based out of. But you and I both native New Yorkers, so we'll be on the same page of this whole thing. Other than the fact that you're a Mets fan and I'm a Yankees fan, we'll let that part go. But let's start back to how you got in the military because you, much like me, as a kid growing up in New York, a lot of people went to the military then. It wasn't really like the greatest of options prior to the 9/11 world. It was almost like, why were you doing that?
Yeah, correct. So I have no military background or experience in my family. We're sort of young Americans coming to America in 1927. And it was 1998, and I got recruited to play basketball. And it was to West Point, and it was the education, and it was the ability to play Division I basketball. And sort of the coach and the recruiters at the time was, no one's going to mess with the U.S. There's no war in sight. So that was sort of the world that we lived in from 1998 to 2001.
Yeah, and when you said West Point to your family, what did they say to you?
My mother said, no way. A God-fearing, good Catholic woman was, no way of going there. My dad perked up with the zero tuition, and being the youngest of three boys, and my older brother is having to pay for college. It was sort of get a scholarship or don't get to college in a way. So that was appealing to a certain extent. Was there any part of West Point when your mother walked on the campus there? Because if you've never been there, you think about West Point and how regal it may be, but when you get there, you kind of get a real sense of what the whole thing is about. Did any of that sway your mom? No.
Oh, really?
She always has these intuitions that she just felt that this was not a good thing the whole time. Listen, very supportive, of a terrific mother. I'm not trying to go that. Hopefully she doesn't listen to this, but very supportive in any way possible. But I don't think she ever really gave in to the whole West Point experience. All right. So you decide to go. The experience in and of itself for you prior to 9/11. Yeah, hard. It was basically every weakness that I have, which are many, were completely exploited by the West Point experience. Just from, I'm not flexible. I can't even touch my knees, unless my toes, but I have to take a gymnastics class. I didn't know how to swim. I was a rock swimming, so I'm taking swimming at 6 a.m. before going to math class, which I'm not as strong in math, more of a English literature major. And then on top of that, playing Division I basketball and just, your day is just basically filled from 5:30 a.m. to 11 at night with the best of the best from 50 states that are really smart, really athletic, and really get after it. So it was hard. I would explain it in that one word.
All right. For those who don't know, we're going to get to a very sensitive topic for Joe here, and that is 9/11, and I'll let him explain it. But you were a senior at that point in time at West Point?
Yeah, I was a senior at firstie at West Point at the time.
All right. So you come back from summer vacation, late August, right? You'd been in school, 2 or 3 weeks at this point? Where were you?
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, 2 or 3 weeks. It was the weekend previous to 9/11. It was ring weekend. Where all the firsties, they get in their best dress and the dress mess, and they have their dates. And we actually went to New York City. We did a boat cruise and the World Trade Center in the background. So it really sticks out in my mind as that feeling of security and safety. And we're at a military academy, but we're studying normal regular college subjects, and we're playing sports and so on and so forth. So there was a real dichotomy those first 3 weeks of my senior year at West Point in college leading up to 9/11.
The morning of, take me through the events prior to the first notification that a plane had hit a tower. What were you doing?
Definitely. So I was in class. I was in a Native American literature class. And I remember during the whole, the initial, when the plane hits the tower. So I think we must have left class maybe, 15 minutes after the planes hit the towers. And if you've ever been to West Point, or if you've ever been to West Point when cadets are going to class, it's like mice in a maze. You see the same people at the same time, at the same moment, at the same second every day going to their class. I'm going to my class. It's just like clockwork.
Military precision, we call it.
Yeah, exactly. You're saluting the same colonel that's going to teach his class. And I remember stepping out into the hallway and start heading back to my barracks room, and there was something off. I wasn't seeing the same people. There was people whispering and talking, and I went up 6 flights of stairs to Bradley Long Barracks towards my room, and my roommate Joe Peppers at the time came down the hallway and said, Quinny, turn on the TV. The World Trade Center's on fire, and I clicked on it, and that was the first time I saw, the towers in flames. And so 2 things about that. One, my initial reaction was that it was a prop plane. It just didn't. The size of the towers were so immense. It just didn't look like a big deal at the time.
Much like everybody thought. I mean, that was a lot of the initial reaction because no one had any video at that point in time of any plane hitting the tower. That didn't come until hours later, but everybody thought it was a small prop plane that just had an accident.
Exactly. And then my mother called me on my phone in my room, and I answered in a typical groggy cadet voice because we're always tired. And she's just like, "Oh, are you sleeping? I'm sorry, are you sleeping?" I'm like, "No, I'm not sleeping. Like, are you watching this?" And her first words was, "I know, I'm watching this. Oh my God, my son is going to go to war. I told you should have went to NYU." So that mother's intuition followed me through my senior year, not even thinking that my brother Jimmy was in any danger on the 102nd floor of the North Tower.
So the North Tower gets hit. Your mom is more worried about you at this point in time than your older brother who is in the building.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just sort of the moments in our lives just progressively got worse from there.
Did it occur to you to say, have you talked to Jimmy?
Well, yeah. And then we just, yes. And then it was sort of that after that statement was like, well, did you hear from Jimmy? And he had a cell phone actually at the time. I think he actually had the original cell phone where the antenna hit the ceiling.
Yeah.
But all the wires were crossed. And then that, from there, she said, all right, my dad, who's a retired cop at NYPD, he's just like, dad's calling all his friends. And it was just that mad scramble from there of, where's my brother? Where's Jimmy?
Take me through the next hour, 2 hours. I mean, what are you doing? When does it really start to hit you that, oh man, this is worse than we thought?
Yeah. And then so immediately I started calling his cell phone. and he had the same voicemail. Can't get to the phone right now. Please leave your name and number as soon as possible. And that's embedded in my brain because it was just repeated over and over again after each and every call. And and then watching everything unfold on the television. And it, then the South Tower collapsed. And honestly, so my brother was 23 years old. He was right out of Manhattan College. He was a year and a half into the job, just, first job out of college. And I was at West Point. I didn't know what tower he was in. I didn't, it was just a mad scramble of calling home and finding out where he is. And then when that South Tower collapsed, my heart just collapsed. And then, calling home, like which tower he's in, what tower he's in. And then realizing, although the North Tower was hit first, it didn't fall first. It was up for about 90 minutes. So there was hope in those 90 minutes that there was time to get out, and just not really knowing the dire situation of the people caught above the 100, the point of impact between the 93rd and 99th floor. And then from there, I remember looking over and I realized there was about 30 people in my room. Cadets started coming in and I started screaming at them, and I started cursing at my TAC officer, which is probably not the right thing to do at that time. And then, there was an email like, pray for Joe Quinn's mother who's in the tower. And I'm like, my mother's not in the tower. And it was just this very kind of overwhelming situation until for 90 minutes until the North Tower collapsed. And, I think for all Americans, there was some visceral experience to watching the towers collapse. And for me, my life, hasn't been the same since.
I can't imagine the torture you were going through. You and I talked previously before recording, and, I had friends in that building as well. And, I had friends on Wall Street that day, and, your mind just races all over the place. And I remember trying to pick up my cell phone and call everybody I knew, and I just kept getting that beep, 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 beep. Back then when you couldn't get through, when the towers were flooded, it just kept giving you a beep, 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 and you'd hang up. And, I started calling my family. Again, everybody from my family is in New York. I wasn't in New York at the time, but, I'm calling like crazy to try to find my brother who was working in Manhattan at the time. And, that's sort of those moments of hysteria overwhelm you. And what's interesting, I guess interesting is not the right word, but, everybody we've talked to who was not in the military on 9/11 but connected to the military prior to 9/11, when 9/11 happens and I ask them what their first thought was, everybody's thinking, well, we're going to war. I'm sure that was the furthest thought from your mind.
Yes. I mean, the furthest thought. The next phase was trying to get the hell out of West Point. And, I hope there's, I hope years later I can't be in trouble for this, but I essentially went AWOL. And it was because it was your brain says one thing, and your heart says another. Your brain is, there's no chance he survived this, particularly with each minute that goes by. But your heart is, he has amnesia in a hospital in New Jersey somewhere, and we got to hit the streets and find him. And particularly the West Point experience, I was a Brooklyn kid playing basketball, and, you're a cadet in your cadet uniform for, 4 years, 3.5 years leading up to that. And I remember just putting on my old clothes, my baggy jeans and my shirt, and leaving the academy and thinking, I'm not coming back here. This is over for me. And
why did you think it was over?
Because to your point, like, as far as being attacked or war was the furthest thing from my mind. My ultimate mission was finding my brother, and I didn't care. And that I've had this feeling that's going to take longer than I expect. And, the academy doesn't give out, long passes very long. And I just wasn't going to go back on their timeline. So I took a boat across the river to the Amtrak, and then went downtown, and immediately started heading downtown, just trying to get as far back as possible. And there was just police barricade. And this is the next day, the next morning, as my TAC officer had me on lockdown. And, I remember going down there, and the easiest way to explain it, it's like I've never seen a hole that's like 30 stories high. It was just the wreckage. It was something out of a movie theater, and it wasn't until I called home and my mother said, come home. And I said no. And then my father, who's a retired cop, said, get your effing ass home. And then I was like, all right, I'm coming home,
Right.
And then, and then it was just, I get home and it was just 100 people. I'm coming from Marine Park, Brooklyn, which is just a neighborhood of cops and firemen. And if you're halfway decent at math, like maybe you go to Wall Street, and it was just like it was almost like a graduation party, but no one was graduating, just people bringing over food and so on and so forth.
All right. So how do the next couple of days go? I mean, I'm sure it's emotionally a blur for you when you try to think back and remember it, but does anything stand out?
Yeah. So, my father, my oldest brother, Michael, my uncle Tommy, we went down to the city and we were, one of the families putting up flyers, and the people around the city at that time, the city was just, filled with flyers of just missing people. It's the only way we could treat the circumstances was that this person's missing. And then going to an event with Kenneth Fitzgerald, and that's where Howie Lutnick, the CEO of Kenneth Fitzgerald, basically told the audience that no one got out. There was 658 employees in Kenneth Fitzgerald on between the 102nd and 104th floor, and basically saying, no one got out. And then I remember, kind of breaking down, and there was a social worker there basically saying, I told my father and said, look out for your youngest. Usually the youngest kind of react in negative ways. And I can remember overhearing that, and then just, eventually the same way my father told me to get home, he said, your ass is going back to West Point. And it was just this weird circumstance where, 2 months, 6 weeks to 8 weeks later, we had a memorial service, without his body. And there was, 1,000 people into the church, and we had speakers. It was like, even outside that, people came to support, the neighborhood came to support. And it's just a weird circumstance now being back at West Point, trying to graduate, even though I can't swim, do gymnastics or math, while this, hovering over me.
They never found any of his remains ever?
They never. He's one of about 1,300 that never found his remains.
And the interesting thing about Kenneth Fitzgerald, the CEO, was the only guy from the company who did survive. I think the story goes, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think he waited to take his daughter to school that day and didn't go in early like he normally did, and that's what ended up saving his life.
Correct. Yeah, it was a very familial company where brothers worked there and cousins and siblings, and he lost his brother on 9/11, who was at Kenneth Fitzgerald. So, Mr. Lucknick lost his brother, but you're correct. He had something to go to, his first day of school for his daughter, and that's sort of why he wasn't there that morning.
All right, so you get back to West Point, and you're having to kind of go through all this with this just unreal emotional burden that you're dealing with. How are you coping day to day when you get back there?
You don't, and if it wasn't for, the patience and the leadership of just some outstanding leaders, a handful that really tried to help me. I know you talk about leadership a lot on this, and sometimes the most shining moments of that is when someone's down on their luck. Someone's not fully optimizing their potential. So it was friends and fellow cadets, and it took a village to kind of get through it.
When does the mental transition for you happen from mourning your brother? And obviously that never stops. I'm not being callous about that. I know you're still mourning him to this day, but at some point there's a transition that goes from, being broken every single day to, I got to get my stuff together because I'm going to war. Yeah.
So, so a couple things. I didn't even know the Pentagon got hit until maybe 2.5 till after the memorial service, maybe 2 months later.
Really?
I mean, that's how, just focused on what transpired in the North Tower. It sounds ridiculous, and again, I'm also in an environment. When I say television at West Point, it was the first time cadets had television in the room. It was a small application on your computer. And we had phones in our room for the first time a year previous. So I'm also in an environment where it's sort of isolated. I'm not watching the 24/7 news cycle. But it was, shortly after I remember, it was almost like the internet was brand new back then. And I remember seeing a picture of Muhammad Atta. And I remember just thinking to myself, I want nothing but revenge. That was it. That it was, you're 21 and, you're attacked personally. And, whatever President Bush wanted me to do, that's what I wanted to do. And unfortunately, as we learned, it's not that simple.
No, it's not. And again, I don't mean to try to overtake your grief and everything, but I remember doing the same thing. I mean, I the next day, I was so freaking out. That was my city. Those were my towers. Those were my people that were murdered that day. And I remember walking into my armory a day or two later and said, "Where are we going? Send me. I'm here. What are we doing? Let's go." I was amped. I wanted revenge the same way you did. And that's sort of, it's more than anger. It's just almost the nerve. How dare they? Who the hell has the balls to do this to us?
Yep. 100%.
Okay. You get to graduation. Is this a bittersweet moment?
Yes. Listen, it's, probably, my greatest accomplishment of my life. It was, because as I mentioned earlier, it was a hard school for me, and then given the circumstances and, we had 100, being so close, to West Point, 50 miles north of Brooklyn and New York City, I had 100 friends and family, come out, and, President Bush, was actually there and basically gave the Iraq War speech.
I guess you were the first graduating class after 9/11, I assume then.
You're correct. Yes.
Yeah,
we were the first class that graduated. And again, you commit to West Point after your beginning of your junior year. You're kind of locked in for 5 years. But I was also offered, it was just a very politically heavy environment at the time, to get out, that I wouldn't have to do my commitment. But to go back to your original point, I'm like, no way, no, and I would enlist if I got kicked out of West Point, I would have just enlisted, at that point in time. But yeah, graduation was just sort of a surreal moment, that everything that would follow of President Bush being there and basically giving, the case for Iraq, and then, seeing all our classmates and then my family afterwards, and obviously, missing my brother. But, it was sort of a moment where, we had to almost fiend pride for one day and just focus and at least, something good, is happening today, and then we'll deal with the rest tomorrow.
You commissioned as what type of officer, and where are you going next?
Second lieutenant.
That I knew. I knew what branch.
In the artillery. Well, listen, I swear to God, this is going to sound crazy, but I never thought of the military experience. It was like every day it was just survival. So it was like, I remember the commissioning ceremony being like, all right, what's this yellow bar? Okay, I'm a second lieutenant now. Like, all right. And like I was walking around, all my pins were backwards. I'm like, because literally it's like you're in your cadet uniform, you graduate, and then all the cadets scatter to different parts of West Point to do your commissioning ceremony. And that part's not planned. It's all individually planned. So it was sort of like, okay, I guess it was second lieutenant. And I had my roommate actually choose my, so I was artillery. And it really just came down to, having a not really a very good class rank. And then also the realization, a couple of branches I didn't get because of that class rank. And then it was sort of the right fit for me for that. So then I went on to my roommate, Joe Peppers, chose Fort Sill, Oklahoma for me. So that's where I went next.
Culture shock for a kid from New York, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. That's why I said I go Iraq and Afghanistan included. Oklahoma was the biggest cultural.
Yeah, brother, I know the pain of Killeen, Texas. So that place was in a lot of cases worse than Baghdad on several different ways. How quickly do you end up deploying? What's your unit first? Where are you going, and how quickly do you end up in Iraq?
Yeah, so, again, and, I really got to own up to that. I was not the best cadet, and I was not the best second lieutenant, when I got to Fort Sill, and I was just still dealing with all these emotions and grief and just trying to kind of get by and survive. But one thing I knew, Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever it was, I just wanted to deploy. So I wasn't focused on, a lot of guys were trying to get into Ranger School or Airborne School or some other school or try to get what post they wanted. I just wanted to deploy. So after the officer basic course, I deployed. So this would be, first of all, actually, I was able to stay an extra couple months at West Point after graduation to be closer to my family. But then I went to OBC, and then I deployed to Iraq with 2.5 FA, which was attached to the 30 CR in September of 2003.
Okay. All right. So 2 things here. One, when you went to Fort Sill, did anybody know about your personal situation? Like, was it almost like you were wearing a scarlet letter?
No, just my roommate.
Okay. So nobody else, like none of your teachers knew, nobody else knew.
No, I just didn't want to talk about it. You know, it's just nobody wants to hear it. At least that's what I thought at the time.
All right. And then one more. As you find out you're going to Iraq, there's no anger because of this whole thing originating from Afghanistan. The guys who killed your brother were from Afghanistan. There wasn't any of, what the hell am I going to Iraq for?
I wanted to go to Afghanistan, and I would badger people. All right, I'm in this. I don't know how I got to SIL. I'm in this artillery. How do I get to Afghanistan? What unit's going to Afghanistan? But at the same time, as the run up, while I'm at Fort Sill, it was the weapons of mass destruction are in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein has ties to Al Qaeda, and that was good enough for me. Let's go. Let's do this.
Okay. September 2003, you get to 6 months after the invasion, and so you're there for OIF 1. Weird time then, because a lot of the initial combat was over, and then you're just kind of sitting there, and literally we're just waiting for the hornet's nest to get pissed. Like that's kind of what was happening at that point in time, correct?
Yeah, and again, typical cherry lieutenant. You think I get laughed at, but I wasn't. But our battalion took on a casualty to a roadside bomb, and I was at above a battle update brief, and we're talking, and I'm the brand new lieutenant, and they kept an IED. Let's check for IEDs here, IED, and I'm just like, smoke. What the F is an IED? And it was so early in the war that it was actually a good question. Like it was like a normal question for a second lieutenant to ask. Like it was like that's an improvised explosive device. That, there's people, but don't worry too much about it. They're not as lethal. And we were rolling over things, and they would just pop like one shell, and they'd break a tire. And it wasn't until Specialist Nevaeh hit one, and we had a casualty that was like, okay, let's start really kind of looking at it. So there's this combination of the insurgency brewing. And then the mortars and pop shots and all that. And then at the same time, trying to train. And, as artillery unit, you have all these odd jobs at the time. So you're doing patrols, which is not as good as an artilleryman because we're a little heavier than the infantry. We need a little more water to kind of get through a hot day. And then we're training at the time, I think it was called the Iraq Civil Defense Corps or something like that. We trained for a weekend, give them 100 AK-47s, and we wouldn't see them the next week. They take the AKs, the paycheck, and not come back. So it was just the beginning of sort of like that shit show of that would brew and foretell everything that would happen. That from that point forward.
When you took that first casualty, 2 questions. One. What did it do emotionally for you? Again, it's military can be like family. These are guys that you train with and and everything else. So it tends to hit people very hard. And then 2, did the thought ever dawn on you, what the hell am I doing here? My brother's already gone. Why am I risking my ass for this?
So it was November 2nd, 2003. It was the most loss of life of the coalition and U.S. forces to that point. And we had 6 members of our battalion, 3 from my battery, that were killed when their Chinook was shot out of Fallujah. And part of it was this debate. We didn't know how long we were going to be there. And I remember Saddam getting caught, and it was like, "Sir, are we going home now?" I'm like, "Yeah, I guess so, right? Like that, right? I mean, it sounds like it, right?" And then there was this question of mid-tour leave, and of course, nobody wants to go. Like, I'm not leaving my brothers here. I'm not going to be that guy that leaves. So the command staff got together, and I was for making them go. There was folks, one one of our soldiers whose wife was pregnant, or, there was those sorts of circumstances that go home, take 2 weeks, go see your family, and then we'll be here. We'll take care of everything else and come back. And those were the 6 soldiers that were in that bird when it was shot, and, over Fallujah, they were all killed. And I remember getting to the command team and having to go back to, my FDC and the platoon and say, who was killed. And again, I was new to the battalion. My soldiers were training with these folks for, 2 years, and also I was completely emotionally numb. I read off their names like the away team in a baseball game, and they just went into hysterics. And I remember just looking at them, and it's just something that I regret and feel shame about to my core to this day. I'm just like, what's wrong with them? I was just so emotionally, I just lost that part of me at that point in my life. And it was just sort of, get back to work, and, we have to fire artillery and patrol tomorrow. So get your shit together,
Why do you feel regret about that? I mean, I get it when you are doing it retrospectively, but, as you get further away from that moment, is it something you still feel regret from?
Yeah, to a certain extent, and that's why I do what I currently do, because it's, my family was attacked. As you said, our city was attacked, and, all the, 7,000 plus, soldiers and military members have been killed since then, and tens of thousands physically wounded, and even more with invisible wounds. So I still, try to channel that for good now, but, it's just a moment in time where I was also charged with, packing, doing their personal effects and packing it up. And, I remember seeing, photos of their family, and just, going through a certain similar situation of a family member having loss, and, not having empathy at that point of time. It's just something I still always think about. And, now, fast forward, you start building a family, and knowing that, Specialist Conover, his wife was pregnant and no longer with us. It's just, those are the moments, the emotions around that I think we struggle with more than the explosions or the violence,
But at no point in time did the thought ever enter your head, my mother's already lost one child, I need to get the hell out of here and get home?
No. And that's part of the reason I try not to tell anyone. And I think eventually it leaked out, through fellow friends and cadets that I went to Fort Sill with. They were in battalion that told my, command team, because I didn't want that, that sort of mentality, not only for myself, but for anyone else. I was a soldier just like anyone else, and didn't want that to enter my battery commander's mind or my battalion commander's minds, at all. And I didn't tell my parents I was deploying until we got, until I got to Germany, and the next plane was to Kuwait, because I was just trying to avoid that mentality.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was fortunate enough, my first deployment, I deployed with, I don't know if you know the name Ronald Buca Jr. Ronald Buca, the firefighter, is an iconic picture of him carrying all this stuff, walking up the steps as everybody is walking down. And I forget which tower it's in, but ultimately Ronald Buca Sr. never made it out. He's one of the 343 firefighters who were killed that day, and his son deployed with me, and I always wanted to go up to him and say something to him. I passed him all the time, and I never had the courage, because I didn't know if I knew what to say or the right thing to say, but I kind of just wanted to, as a fellow New Yorker, throw my arms around him and say, hey man, I'm sorry about the loss of your dad, but, and they wore t-shirts. They had a run there in Iraq, and this was 2005, when I was there with him, but they had a run, honoring him, and they had t-shirts made with his name on it and everything. So everybody kind of knew, but I kind of almost felt like I was being that guy, almost like walking up to a professional athlete and saying hello and telling him how much you love him. It was just kind of like one of those weird, awkward moments you didn't know how to approach. But once people started to figure it out, did anybody come up to you and say anything?
I'm trying to think back. No, again, I think eventually it got to the command team, more so, my flight platoon that I was with. So, eventually, no, I really don't think so. Not to that sort of degree.
Okay. How does this first deployment finish up? I mean, I know you sustained more casualties and everything else, but what's kind of, when you look back on it, what does this deployment mean? What does it do for you? How does it end?
Yeah, no, we go back to, one of your questions. I remember, Specialist Preston, we were smoking, dipping, like looking out, the sun was going down, and we're just, out. We were in by Hit. We kind of went in to Anbar. We started in Fallujah, then Ramadi, and then we basically built up like a small fort and then keep moving west. And then I remember looking down. I remember, he goes, "What are we doing here?" It's just like, "Oh, well, we're here to, have them shoot at us rather than the FOB and have counterfire and all, the whole stuff." He's like, "No, like, what are we doing here in Iraq?" And it was probably the most honest thing I said to that point. I just said, I don't know, So it just sort of finished up. And I remember right before we left, I think it was April 2004. And looking back, we were at Al-Assad and just watching these white Connexes just be delivered. It was just endless rows of white Connexes. And just thinking that, we're going to be here for a while. We're building cities here. Mm-hmm. This isn't going to be short. And we drove, back. We convoyed back through Iraq to Kuwait, and then seeing the Marines come in, because that was the first time the Marines came in 2000. That spring of 2004. And then just saying a prayer because because the insurgency was just every day building up and getting worse, and just saying, God bless them. This is going to be a tough couple of years here.
All right. You come back from the first deployment. Are your parents saying, "Get out, I want you to stay home"? What are your feelings? What are your thoughts? How much, obviously your brother is still with you, but how much of the motivation for revenge is still there?
Yeah. So then, no, 100%. And then it was still, all right, I got to go to Afghanistan. That was it, And so I ended up, hanging out my unit. I ended up being a general's aide. And that's actually where I met my wife.
Wait a minute. You, the not so good cadet, the not so good second lieutenant ends up becoming a general's aide. Was this a punishment assignment, or is it because you actually had improved?
A little bit of both. So, a couple things. I said, hell no, I do not want, you're on the line, you're able to use language a little loosely when you're on the line, and motor pool and whatnot. And, it was basically that job was like kind of going back to the point, you know what I mean? And, I think part of it, I was one of just a handful of lieutenants on the base that had a combat patch at the time. That was like sort of a new thing for units as we were coming back from OIF-1. And this particular General Mark Graham wanted, a veteran that to deploy, and for good reason. He lost his son in Kaladia in Anbar, which was just, a couple clicks away from me where I was at the time. So he wanted to have aid with that experience.
When you had found out he had lost a son, did you feel like the job almost was meant for you, given what you had gone through?
Yeah. So, the Grahams have just, an incredible story of their own. So the Grahams, they lost Jeff. He was the oldest of the family in February 2004 to an IED in Chaldea. And, he saw the shiny metal object in the bridge. He told his platoon to get back, and that's when it exploded. So he's a hero. He was, the lieutenant you long for, who's on the front lines, patrolling with his unit. I'll check it out, told everyone to get back, saved lives. And that one's, more so easy to talk about. The harder one to talk about is the Grahams lost their middle child, Kevin, to suicide 8 months previous. So they lost two sons within 8 months. And he was an ROTC cadet. And, obviously it was a rough transition to me. I remember answering the phone being like, "Yeah, what do you need?" And he's like, "Oh, Joe, you got to answer like, 'Good morning, sir, man. How may I help you?'" So it was a rough transition of him mentoring me to kind of be more sophisticated on the phones. But as we traveled, we really connected. And I remember we were in Tacoma once, and we were having dinner. And, I told him, I'm like, "Listen, it's just hard. I keep all this in because no one wants to hear about my dead brother." And he's just like, I want to hear about him. And we were able to kind of be open, and he was able to talk about his sons, and I was able to talk about my brother. And it was really, it was really a turning point to really start, opening up and talking about these things.
You still talk to him today?
Yeah, he's my father-in-law.
Oh, when you said it's how you met when you said it's how you met your wife, I just thought you met her through the assignment. I didn't realize it was his daughter.
Yeah, he's my father-in-law, and he's my number one babysitter. So
that is outstanding.
Yeah. So
talk about serendipity.
Yeah, so it was interesting because, again, I wasn't in the best place in my life, and I honestly told him she was the youngest. We were both the youngest of the family. She was the youngest of three, and we both lost brothers. And then to me, and what it did for me, I don't know even if this is healthy or not, and it's not. I've been told through some sessions that it's not, but like it was almost like, you know what, this woman lost two brothers. I lost one. Like, get over yourself. Like, you know what I mean? And I really was a place of just wanting to kind of help and connect in that regard. The same way General Graham and I were talking. I just didn't know she was going to be drop dead gorgeous.
Listen, I'm not going to lie. That was the next question I was going to go. I'm like, what's it like when you meet your boss's daughter and you're like, damn, she's a smoke show?
Yeah, it was.
How do I figure out how to navigate this without pissing off my boss and still keeping my job and yet somehow dating his daughter?
Yeah, well, I remember, my Uncle Jack, who I told about kind of this situation. He's like, Joe, what are you, nuts? This guy could send you to Guantanamo Bay. What are you doing? And I'm like, geez. But listen, I also chalk it up to, a lot of veterans. I don't know if you get this a lot. We reminisce sometime about like those in between, when you're back home in between deployments, there's this like kind of like don't give an F sort of attitude. Like your time is short, right? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it's not natural to my, to who I am to say, you know what, F it, give it a shot. But I was in that moment, coming back from Iraq and knowing that I'd be gearing up to go elsewhere, and knowing how short my brother's life was like, F it. I think she's awesome. Like, forget everything else, whatever comes, comes, and, so there's a little bit of that, but, they were just like so supportive. So, Mrs. Graham, I went to pick up the General's laundry one day. Well, not his laundry. I take that back. I know Generals get in trouble for that nowadays. It was a different army back then. But it was just to pick up some boxes or whatnot. And she gave me Melanie's number. And that was the hard part, is I had the number for about 2 days. And I'm like, how do I do this? And,
but wait, did you ask the mother for the number, or she just willfully gave it to you?
She just figured that, Melanie was struggling as well. And then it was probably 4 months later that they heard through the grapevine that I lost a brother. Again, I didn't like telling anyone. And it was, probably my former battery commander, battalion commander said, oh, by the way, this is 4 months into the job. Joe lost, a brother as well, the same way Melanie has. And I think it was through that regard that you should connect. And then it was from there, it was a series of just completely not sleeping for, the rest of the year, because it was, it was just, the same young love kind of thing. We're just, up all night talking, but then I had to go to PT and go to work and do the job. And it just really took off from there. But that's the easy part, though, the early part. But we struggled after, once, going back, deploying back, and not really dealing with the underlying trauma that we both experienced.
One more question. Does the General ever approach you and say anything to you about dating his daughter?
So I think after I didn't call after 2 days, he brought me to his office and just said, I know what Carol did. Just, it's okay if you wanted to call her. So I was just like, okay, 100%. I was like, all right, great.
That's fantastic. All right. So the second deployment, you're working for General Graham the whole time?
No, so I was General Graham's aide for about 8 months, and then I was General Mark McDonald's aide after that.
Oh, really?
That job at Fort Sill. And then again, I went to the Captain's Career Course that they made me go to. And then it was, again, talking to Branch, I'm like, Afghanistan. Before the career course, it was, I was like, I want to go to Fort Drum, I want to go to Afghanistan. They're like, holy shit, this is the easiest captain I ever talked to about assignments. He's like, no problem, And then it was 6 months later that everything changed for Branch. That it was it was the drum up to the surge, and it was basically, sorry, Quinn, it's all about Iraq. So then essentially went on to be a staff puke at the for about 17 months during the surge, from November 2006 to about March 2008.
And that's when you were on your second deployment?
Second deployment, yeah. So it was kind of really interesting in that it's funny doing a second deployment, even flying in. You had other like new lieutenants and captains deploying for the first time, and so like there's pictures of me like smiling on the bird, and like because I just I know the trajectory, I know how we're getting there, and
sure.
They don't really know what's happening, and also colonels. It was like there was just people. This is the first deployment for many, so. For me, it was just really helpful to kind of go through those steps before. But the really cool thing, during that time period, I was able to be part of the reconciliation cell, which basically General Petraeus essentially said, I want what's happening in Anbar during the Awakening happening to the rest of the country. And I started as a cell with one person, with one other major, and it turned into a cell of about 25. About doing the Sons of Iraq. So it was just being in meetings with Petraeus came and Odierno. It was just really an interesting look to just travel around the country and just see how the surge operated from that viewpoint.
You're still yearning to get to Afghanistan, which you eventually do with General David Petraeus, who you just mentioned. How does this whole thing come to pass? Because you don't do it in uniform, correct?
Yeah. So after 17 months, Branch tells me, all right, we got a great deal for you. 17 months in Iraq, like we're going to give you $25,000 that's taxed. And then we're going to, we're going to give you a command for a battery that's deploying back to Iraq in 4 months. And I go, listen, for a 3-year commitment, $25,000 after taxes. By the way, I haven't spent a dime in 17 months. I'm Brooklyn rich right now. I don't need the money,
Right.
And so that was just sort of backed into a corner of, maybe I would like to eventually start a family. And I went to Iraq, my second deployment. I was 26. I came home. I was 28. So it was like, you starting thinking. So that's when I got out of the military in 2008.
How much did your future wife at the time have a say in that?
So that was one of, probably the most difficult year as well. And it sounds crazy. And that's the other thing, trying to communicate to people about transition, because I'm out of the military and, my aunt's like singing a novella that finally you're out, you're safe. And I was going to Cambridge to study at the Harvard Kennedy School for 2 years. And you're on terminal leave, and it's for everyone else it's over, but to me it was just the beginning. And it was Melanie was finishing up her nursing degree at Oklahoma, and we essentially haven't seen each other in almost 2 years.
Wow.
And then I went from 26 to 28. She went from 22 to 24. And these are just very moments in your 20s that are very transformative for you. So we didn't know if we were able to survive. So we were apart for that year while she finished up her degree in nursing in Oklahoma, and then me in Cambridge. And it wasn't until the second year that we decided, like, either we lived in the same city together or, we have a chance. And that's when she, came to Boston, and we were together.
So how do you get linked up with General David Petraeus?
So part of the reconciliation cell and, the Sons of Iraq movement, and it was all these colonels and whatnot. And so, again, I studied Afghanistan during my 2 years in grad school. Again, my whole goal was to get back to Afghanistan. And I was thinking, and just seeing how the things changes. Things change it for a point, like where you're doing counterinsurgency, you're seeing the successes of the surge. And to me, it became less about, violent revenge, if you will, of being on the front lines, and more about going to Afghanistan and making a difference. So it was General McChrystal actually set up this advisory that they were looking for people. And I figured that trying to go State Department, trying to go government route would have been taking too long. It was like this. I was kind of lucky being at West Point my senior year that I was immediately commissioned. I could go right away and try to get there right away. all these other routes to Afghanistan took so long. So I was able to be part of an advisory assistance team, and actually started out with General McChrystal because it was all the same folks in the inner circle between McChrystal and General Petraeus. And then the Rolling Stone article happened as soon as I hit the ground in Afghanistan. And then General Petraeus sort of got the band back together for a lot of his staff that was doing stuff. The successes they had in Iraq, they were trying to replicate in Afghanistan.
Kind of fortuitous, I guess, that all that, from a timing standpoint, happened the way it did. So when you finally get to Afghanistan, what's your thought?
I hear a lot of people just swing ideas about policy around Afghanistan, and it's almost a requirement to spend some time on the ground because it's a complete, particularly compared to Iraq, it's a completely different thing.
Oh God, it's two different wars.
And I was naive to think that the experiences that we had, and the other thing to go back to is like, how war changes is here I go with utter revenge against Al Qaeda, but in 2007 I'm shaking hands with former Al Qaeda and Iraq members to bring on the Sons of Iraq and start fighting with us, which was an absolute surreal moment. But to think that we could take those same principles and I wasn't even study it and you apply it in grad school and then apply it to a country like Afghanistan was completely sort of naive.
Yeah, well, we've mentioned this a lot, but there's a reason Afghanistan hasn't been conquered in over 2,000 years. It's not a place where you can survive without living on the ground. The terrain is unmanageable. The temperatures at times can be, varying from hot as hell to freezing, and it's like nothing else that Earth has ever offered. And obviously you know that. But when you leave the Afghanistan experience, do you feel any sense of fulfillment or any sense of completion as far as it pertains to your brother?
No. So the crystallizing moment for me, I wrote this white paper called The Perfect Counterinsurgent, and it was just about forming local police, forming just basically like we did in the Sons of Iraq, that, a kid from Brooklyn's not going to know who the enemy is. The people in the village do. So let's empower them and arm them and so on and so forth. And the police and so on. And I published a report. I wrote something, a part of a blog, and we got the right team in Afghanistan. And on my way back, I'm driving by myself in Kabul, and I come to a checkpoint, and I get an AK-47 shoved in my temple and my forehead, and basically getting screamed at. And then I realized that it was about money. So I had to draw my firearm and say "F you," and it was an Afghan policeman, and I just. It was everything that I studied and trying to change things in Afghanistan. There was other things that we were intel and things we were studying, but it was that kind of physical moment of this is how it is, and that this is not going to change. And it took years. I just published an article in the New York Times this past September. And really, what I finally realized is, the people that killed my brother died the same day he did. Right. I can't kill Muhammad Atta.
Right.
And I know terrorism is a tool. And I know all of this, but for, 19, assholes led by bin Laden and to inflict such damage. And then for us to spend trillions of dollars, you lose 7,000 plus service members, 20,000 injured, 30,000 physically wounded, more dealing with invisible rooms, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of the civilian populace being killed. It just makes you think, how do we end this thing, and what's the utility of doing all this?
Yeah. And I'll say this to people who don't know anything about Afghanistan: you'll never change their culture until they want to change their culture. There's only one simple reason why America has lasted over 200 plus years. It's because we wanted to. It's the bottom line. I mean, there's not any, nobody wrote down a policy that says this is what America is going to be. It came and it was born from a belief that we were going to be a country, an independent country, and have freedoms. And then all the other stuff followed. But until you have that initial belief and that concurrent simultaneous belief that everybody holds together at the same time, nothing there will ever change. And because the people who live a mile away from each other may never talk to each other their entire lives because of the terrain, you'll never get them on the same page because they have completely different needs and completely different wants and desires. And that in and of itself is why Afghanistan is barely even a country in and of itself. You could remove the borders and nobody would know the difference. I mean, that's really what Afghanistan amounts to. It's a pile of rocks in the eastern hemisphere rather. So, I digress. You're more of the political, guy than I am from that standpoint, or at least the political science guy than I am. But that's just one guy's opinion on it. I don't know how far off I am from where you sit.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. Is that it's easy to look at a PowerPoint slide with borders and units and people, but that just that's not real life. Like to your point, it's just this disparate group of people living in different areas and doing their own thing. And, half the villages I've been in, they thought I was Russian, that the Russians were still there, they haven't seen, it's just the fact of what's going on the ground.
All right. So Afghanistan, and listen, I could talk to you about, that whole sort of policy of Afghanistan for hours. It's a very candid and lively discussion to say the least, but we'll move on. And you decide that you now have a new calling in life. How do you end up initially with Team RWB and why and all the circumstances?
Yeah, so I was ended up teaching at West Point in the social department, and I was associate at the Combating Terrorism Center. This is from 2011 to 13 or so. And Mike Irwin, who's my classmate at West Point, we're really good friends.
Oh, really? Mike is a former guest on the Hazard Ground.
Oh, great. Oh, awesome. Yeah, definitely. Mike's, if you haven't, obviously you met Mike, talk to Mike, just high energy, just, one of those people that's really instilling a lot of positivity and great things in the world. And it was, around the time where, social media was becoming prevalent, and I was writing reports and studying about, some knucklehead, terrorist 3,000 miles away, or not more than, thousands of miles away. And then watching, soldiers and people struggling back home. And I'm just like, what the hell am I doing? Like this is happening in my backyard. Some of the struggles our veterans are having, what am I worried about? Some American jihadists that, got apples thrown at him in high school and now joined the jihad and is a big member of Al Qaeda, Adam Gaddan, so it's like, so that was the transformation. Obviously Mike's a very motivating person, and he's like, we need to help veterans transition. So, Mike founded Team White and Blue, and I was sort of one of the earlier adopters. And that was my entry point to work with Team White and Blue for about 4 or 5 years. And then over the last year and a half, transition to the Headstrong Project.
Yeah, and the Headstrong Project is where you are now. Tell me about that and, the core of that as you are now essentially running that whole organization.
Yeah, no, definitely. So while I was out of New York City with Team White and Blue, and I would constantly refer veterans that were struggling, like, I can't sleep or whatnot, or needed mental health support to the Headstrong Project. And, as I was talking about Melanie, my wife and I, before, I remember it was General Petraeus that at the time I went to grad school, and my Melanie was a nurse and so on and so forth. And he said, "Oh, you're an example of like post-traumatic growth." And I just remember feeling awful inside because it was a lie. We were dying. We never dealt with our underlying traumas, and it was in 2015 that I would always refer veterans to the Headstrong Project when I went to the clinical director's office at Headstrong and said I had one more veteran to refer, and it was myself. So, as I tell people, not only the president, but also a client, where my wife, Melanie, and I were able to get help. And now we're, it's not about getting back to even, but we're thriving now, right? We're absolutely thriving. We have 2 kids. Melanie's actually getting her nurse practitioner degree. She's be a nurse practitioner in a year. We're physically healthy. We're mentally, well, her more so than me, but we're physically healthy, mentally healthy. And that's where, for me, is my passion of all these veterans that responded to 9/11. There's no reason they should be struggling back home. So basically, Headstrong's mission is to heal the hidden wounds of war, and it's bureaucracy-free, it's cost-free, it's confidential. You sign up, you would contact within 24 hours, you see a psych, you get a psych evaluation within 48, and you're seeing a therapist unlimited that same week. So that's just basically what it's all about, and we just opened in Atlanta today.
Well, one, congratulations on opening here in Atlanta. This is a market that is full of veterans. Given there's 3 active military posts in this general area, so you have a lot going on from that standpoint. When you sort of put all the pieces of the pie together, do you feel like as the events transpired throughout your life that everything happened the way it was supposed to and for a reason? I mean, is there any sort of value to you in the loss of your brother?
No and yes, and in the sense that no, I don't think there was a plan. But what I would say, and I wrote about this as far as I do believe in post-traumatic growth, and my perspective of life has definitely changed because and Melanie and I, as both of us, because of those experiences, particularly the loss of my brother. So it really just comes down to perspective and really grasping what life is really about. It's about our loved ones and our relationships and just perspective. Like I remember being on a flight and I was a flight out of Denver. We were going to LaGuardia. And we didn't get in on time, so the plane turned around. We're hovering over LaGuardia in New York and went back to Denver, right? It's insane. Don't ask me why they did that. But people were losing their mind. And I remember thinking like, I ate, I have internet, I'm fine. Like, so there's such a more perspective in life and a value of my relationships and just trying to, serve and do great things in life and for people. But I would trade that perspective in a heartbeat to have my brother back, to have Jeff back, to have Kevin back, to have Tommy Kennedy back, to have, Specialist Conover back, to have them all back. And that's sort of the line that, I constantly walk.
Do you and your wife ever compare notes on your losses? Is there any value in that?
Yes and no. It's more about, for a really long time, the only people that were really willing to listen about each other's brothers, particularly for her, because it was so close that she was best friends with Kevin and she was living with Kevin at the time and actually found him, so there's there's that underlying trauma of, being so close to your brother. And then at what point do you even get to your older brother, Jeff? You know what I mean? So it's just been, obviously just on top of the normal things of loving someone unconditionally. But it is really special that we're able to talk about them in normal ways, like for, their birthday or the funny things they do. My brother was a crazy, crazy bastard, and I'm able to tell her those stories, and she's able to talk about Jeff and Kevin in good ways. And then we also allow each other to have bad days, particularly around anniversaries and whatnot. So, we definitely do continue to support each other in that way.
What do you guys tell your kids about their uncles who are gone?
Yeah, so my daughter is 2.5, and my daughter is Beckett, and my son is Graham James, who's named after his uncles. And I don't know, right now it's sort of too early as far as it's too early to really. I think really what it comes down to is how do you describe the violence around them not being here as they get older. It's easier to a point to remember them and talk about them and tell the great stories and who they are and show them the picture and show them their stocking during Christmas and whatnot. But I think we'll have to cross the bridge when we get there as they get older and more sophisticated on war and 9/11 and what it all means.
Have both of your parents ever compared notes as parents who have lost a child?
There's definitely a mutual support particularly around the holidays, that we're definitely stronger together than we would be apart. And so there's just a ton of love and understanding. And particularly my mother-in-law, which is funny because my mother's from Brooklyn and my mother-in-law is from Kentucky. On the phone for 2 hours, and both of them have no idea what the other is saying. They can't interpret. It's just basically like tennis. Like my mother will talk for 20 minutes, and then Mrs. Graham will talk for 20 minutes, and then they'll hang up the phone. Like I have no idea what the other. I couldn't interpret a word they were saying. But yeah, I mean, listen, as far as Melanie and I losing and dealing with the loss of siblings, I can't imagine, particularly being a father now, losing a child. So for them to have that together is definitely powerful.
One more on your family, and just because, we talk a lot about the human condition, but you guys are stronger together. When you are together, do you feel more loss than love?
No. No.
Because it's a lot of loss, Joe. I mean, there's a lot of pain in that room, man.
Yeah, no, definitely. And listen, it's just not even a couple. I think it's human nature. I described there was 1,000 people in that church celebrating my brother. After 9/11, we were never closer as a country. Loss brings people together. Loss brings love. It's the antidote. Loss. So they coexist, but I always think love burns brighter.
All right, let's take it back to veterans for a moment. The numbers are out there, the statistics. I don't need to tell them to you. If you could sort of verbally detail a plan on how we change those numbers, what does it sound like?
Definitely. Listen, it's plain language that Headstrong, we want to end suicide. And that sounds like a crazy statement, and it will probably be a generational thing. And we're going to need innovation and things to change in DOD and the VA and a lot of other things to get there. But from the viewpoint of Headstrong, so what we do is we partner with best-in-class private clinicians across the country. 100,000 private practice clinicians spread out across the country. And within a mile or 5 blocks of that clinician, there's a veteran in need with PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, whatever it means. So it's not too crazy to think if those two entities meet and you start getting back to being the better version of yourselves, because it's about stabilizing. How do you get to a stable place to be able to talk and communicate and go through therapy? How do you reprocess it, whether it's EMDR or whatever modalities that we have as evidence-based practices, to go through your trauma? And then the next step is integration. How do you integrate back to society and do things like mindfulness, whatever it might be, and tailoring it specifically to the veteran's needs? Because I'm not going to say, Joe Quinn, you deployed, you're so blessed, you got PTSD and 12 steps. It does not work that way. Our motto is, how many lives can we save in the process to get to the end state?
Joe, it's an amazing journey, an amazing tale. I know there's not a day that goes by that you're not feeling a little bit of sense of pain at a minimum for the loss of your brother. But obviously, you've moved to a place where, as you just mentioned, there's a lot more love than loss, and that's as good as it's going to get, or as best as it can be, given all the circumstances between you and your wife and the lives around you. But again, your story of serving your country and everything that you've done is incredible, and keep up the great work with Headstrong. I know RWB is better for you having been part of it, and Headstrong will continue to go on and continue to do all the great things and enrich veterans' lives. And certainly, brother, it's a pleasure meeting you. It's a pleasure knowing you. Despite the fact that you are a Met fan, I do love you.
I knew that was.
Yeah, I had to wrap it. I had to bring it back to that, but as we always bring it there, but. That said, again, man, I wish you nothing but the best. I'm here for you, brother. I love you, and let's stay in touch. But thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Definitely, and by the way, we firmly believe about ending the stigma. The signal divide is telling our stories. I listened to 4 or 5 podcasts last night, so thanks for what you're doing, and from one fellow New Yorker to another, and that's our 1-0, and the Yankees are 1-0. We'll still see what happens this summer.
Joe Quinn, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thanks, Mark.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.